Okay, well, thank you very much, Pedro, for that introduction, and thank you, Nestlé, for having me here to London to present. I'm going to speak about optimizing musculoskeletal health and physical function, and the role of protein, and specifically then the interaction between protein and physical activity. These are my disclosures in terms of some of the funding that our lab uses to do the work that we do, and different companies that have supported some of the work and have paid me either travel expenses or honoraria. When we talk about sarcopenia, it's the age-related decline in muscle mass, strength, and function. I don't know, I keep changing the number at the beginning of where this starts the older I get. So today it starts at 60. We know that it proceeds at a rate of about 1% per year, and it's multifactorial. So the things that influence sarcopenia could be related to anabolic hormones, microcirculation, factors within the muscle itself, but two variables over which we have control are exercise and nutrition. And as you just heard from Pedro, the problem is that older people are anabolically resistant. It's a condition that has analogous conditions, if you like, to insulin resistance, except it's resistance to the impact of normal exercise or physical activity and delivery of amino acids. So first I'm going to talk a little bit about protein requirements, and this is Dan Traylor, who was a postdoc in my lab, and this is the key paper around which we took a really deep dive and looked at recommendations for protein requirements beyond nitrogen balance. So here are 6 key references. The RAND paper that's highlighted there, number 5 in blue, is the paper on which the current recommended dietary allowance is based at 0.8 grams of protein per kilo per day. And the Campbell paper is another nitrogen balance study that was done looking in older people as well. The 4 yellow references are using the indicator amino acid oxidation method, which is a stable isotope method developed by Paul Pinchards and Ron Ball in Toronto to try and estimate protein requirements in older population. What we find is when we look at the original RAND analysis, only 14 of the 235 data points actually come from older individuals. And importantly, they decided arbitrarily that there wasn't enough data to make the conclusion that older people needed more protein. Campbell found the same thing, and in a reanalysis of the RAND data using data which was excluded from the original analysis, so nitrogen balance, they actually found that older people required about 1.05. When we look at the estimates from indicator amino acid oxidation studies, they come out at consistently 1.2. If we took all of these at face value, it would indicate a protein requirement of at least 1.15 grams of protein per kilo per day. And that's been reflected in a number of review papers and position stands. This one from the ProDate study that I happen to be involved with indicates that older people probably should be consuming at a minimum of between 1 to 1.2. They need more in acute or chronic illness or disease, and even more in severe illness or marked malnutrition. So what are older people consuming in terms of protein? If you were to look to the popular press, and I hate to pick on the British tabloids as a great example, they will run a story, usually in about June or July every year when it's a low news season, about how everybody is getting enough protein. But when we look at older individuals and we use the current recommended dietary allowance and the estimated average requirement, you could probably be tricked into thinking that older people were getting enough protein. And this is based on 3-day diet records. And when we analyzed the same data and we applied what we think are the estimated average requirement and proposed RDA, so between 0.9 and up to 1.2, you can see that older individuals are not hitting these intakes. And I think anybody that works in the area of geriatrics would say that that's pretty self-evident. Older people have a hard time getting protein into their diets. They have issues with dentition, they have issues with satiety, they have issues with food selection or food insecurity. There's some other facts that are relevant when we talk about older people in the protein landscape. First of all, aging is associated with protein energy undernutrition. It may not be malnutrition, pure and simple, but it's definitely less than is optimal. We know for a fact that when older people consume protein at the RDA, that they see reductions in their muscle area, we see reductions in their muscle strength, and I would put it to you that if they were held on those intakes for longer, we would also see reductions in muscle function. So the conclusion, at least, that I would make is that older people need more protein. 1.2 would appear to be the minimum that I would ask older people to be consuming. And I think we could probably expect that there would be benefits to intakes beyond that level. And older adults are not consuming these intakes. In fact, many older adults are consuming protein at less than the RDA. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and focus on muscle protein turnover. This has been something my lab has been involved with over the last 25 years. I'm at McMaster. And some of you are probably familiar with these types of curves that we've drawn in a number of review papers. And it just highlights that the controlling factor from a muscle standpoint is muscle protein synthesis. So you can see here muscle protein synthesis is in yellow, muscle protein breakdown is in red, and the most responsive factor to the ingestion of this would be protein at breakfast, lunch, and dinner is muscle protein synthesis. Muscle protein breakdown doesn't change much unless you're in a state of, say, a severe illness or critical illness. The green areas represent a small period of time in which muscle is making a net new protein gain, and the gray areas represent a time in which muscle is losing that same protein. So you can see it's a meal-to-meal response. And of course, this is probably not the real-world scenario because this indicates the same amount of protein at each meal and spaced evenly throughout the day. What we do know is that with exercise, and particularly loading exercise, there's a greater amplitude and duration of the response of protein synthesis, and there's a reduced catabolism in the fasted state. So resistive exercise, which can be walking or going up a flight of stairs for somebody who's not particularly active, but loading exercise results in a fundamentally anabolic stimulus that promotes muscle protein accretion. I would say probably about 15 years ago, we were interested in what the per meal protein dose that was optimal and realizing that when you ingest carbohydrates and lipids, they are substrates for generation of fuel. They are burned. The difference with protein is that there is a finite storage capacity for amino acids. You have to use them within the time that they are elevated in the bloodstream. And anything beyond the ability to use and store those amino acids is going to result in the production of urea and probably the generation of either glucose from the carbon skeleton that remains, or it's an oxidizable substrate. This is work from Dan Moore when he was a PhD student in my lab. And really quickly, I'm just going to give you the graph on this side of the figure here. So on your left is what we see in younger individuals. And this is the myofibrillar protein synthetic rate. And we've done this linear breakpoint analysis. So at what point does the curve inflect and essentially flatten off? And you can see that the breakpoint is about 0.24 grams of protein per kilogram per meal. If you look at what happens in older individuals, the curve is shifted to the right. The inflection point occurs at almost 0.4 grams of protein per kilo, and there is a wide standard deviation. This is the 90% confidence interval, and that's probably due to the low number of data points we have in this sample. But it certainly makes the point that the meal-induced rises in muscle protein synthesis in aging are definitely lower, and this is this phenomenon known as anabolic resistance, that we propose is one of the key factors that underpins the loss of muscle mass as people age. And Sarah Oikawa, who's a grad student in my lab, drew these figures, and these are more realistic. So older people, at least from the 3-day food records that we've collected, we have over 800 of them now, ingest around 12 grams of protein at breakfast. They then ingest a larger amount of protein at the lunchtime meal, and the largest amount of protein is in the evening meal at dinner. This may be reversed in some countries, and you may shift that late meal to, say, the lunchtime meal, maybe in Mediterranean countries, for example. But there's a point I want to make with this, and that is that the protein threshold per meal is hit 2 times a day in an average younger person that weighs 85 kilos. But in an older person weighing the same amount, they only reach that peak threshold 1 time per day. So they're suboptimally stimulating protein synthesis, which brings into the question about protein source. Does it matter what type of protein you consume? And I would put it to you that the answer is yes. The active amino acid in this process is definitely leucine for muscle. Leucine, as you know, is a branched chain amino acid. It signals through canonical pathways that really center on mTOR, and in activating mTOR, then it stimulates a downstream process that results in protein synthesis. Thanks to some fantastic work from David Sabatini's lab at MIT, we now have a mechanism for this. Cestrin-2 binds leucine as a putative leucine sensor and removes inhibition, and we get protein synthesis. That's led us to propose this, what we call a leucine trigger hypothesis, and it goes something like this. You can ingest a low dose of protein, and you're not going to reach this plateau level that I've indicated as the trigger here. If you're physically active, the trigger actually goes down, and you can get away with a lower dose of protein. The problem is that if you're inactive, or if you have multimorbid conditions like many older people do, the trigger goes in the opposite direction. You either need more protein or more leucine. And this is an important finding, and I'm showing this is data from Sylvia Zwiga and Glenda Courtney Martin. Glenda trained with Paul Pancharts and Ron Ball at Sick Kids University in Toronto. And they've determined the dietary leucine requirements of older men and women in this study. Importantly, and you can see that women are a little bit greater, this actually, when you express it per kilogram of lean body mass, highlights that the leucine requirements of older individuals are probably twice what are currently recommended. And it may be that, given its importance, you can see here in muscle protein synthesis, current leucine recommendations should be revised. And that's a finding that is consistent with the IAAO oxidation method, but yet inconsistent with nitrogen balance. So what does all of this mean? Well, you can't come here from McMaster University and not talk a little bit about evidence-based medicine or evidence-based science. So this is Everson Nunez. He's a postdoc in my lab. We conducted a systematic review and meta-analyses. We looked at the characteristics of a number of 74 different RCTs, about 2,300 individuals, and determined that protein ingestion, when you augmented it through either supplement or dietary sources, that you did end up with a small effect. You can just see that the rhombus, maybe you can't actually see the line there, but it shifted just to the right. There's no effect of just protein supplementation per se. There's not been a study done to date that has been long enough to make that conclusion. But definitely when you combine protein ingestion with resistance training, you get an anabolic effect that's greater than no protein supplementation. It's a dose response. Not surprisingly, again, when you look at some of these outcomes, they're more significant when you get up to higher intakes. In younger people, those intakes are at least 1.6 grams of protein per kilo per day. In older people, we actually don't know where that is because there aren't enough studies at these types of intakes, but you can see there's a small effect at somewhere between 1.2 to 1.59, but nothing below 1.2. So you really need to get older people up to a level of intake that I would recognize is pretty hard to do. What we found was that there were effects on muscle strength. We got a greater lower body strength, we got a greater bench press or pushing strength, but we saw no impact on physical function changes, and we definitely saw no impact on hand grip strength. The quick takeaway is that protein supplementation then, through either dietary sources or supplements per se, is sufficient, and when you look at maximizing, if you like, potential gains in muscle mass and function, it's actually necessary. But for older people, it's going to be difficult to do. What about other compounds? There's been a lot of focus on beta-hydroxy-beta-methylbutyrate. It's essentially a metabolic cousin of leucine. It's limited in its production in humans because we lack the dioxygenase enzyme. And what we wanted to do in this was essentially to say, what's the evidence or the level of evidence that's out there for beta-hydroxy-beta-methylbutyrate or leucine as a key ingredient? So we conducted an umbrella review of systematic reviews. There were 15 different meta-analyses that were included in this. You can see quickly this is a sort of a bias table, if you like. Every red dot is that the information was either unavailable or not reported. And what essentially we found was that HMB supplementation did not have an effect on strength outcome. That's probably because you simply can't get enough of this into circulation to stimulate muscle protein synthesis, and it doesn't work unless you combine it with resistance training. And then resistance training is such a powerful stimulus that you're not going to be able to augment it over and above with ingestion of HMB. So the current evidence, we concluded, was insufficient to assess the impact of HMB, and there was inconsistent reports for HMB as part of an oral nutritional supplement with respect to the augmentation of lean soft tissue mass. That's the best we can do with DEXA, improvements in strength or physical function. Not that dissimilar from protein, but there's really no difference, and we put this figure in the paper to highlight that on a gram per gram basis. This is muscle protein fractional synthetic rate between leucine and HMB. They signal through the same canonical pathways. They regulate things through the same proteins, so I wouldn't expect for there to be a difference anyway. I'm just going to touch briefly on bone and joint health. And what you often hear, or you don't hear it as much anymore, I would give these talks on protein, and people would say, well, what about protein making your bones more fragile? And pointing to studies looking at protein and increased calcium excretion. The answer is that 40% of your bone's mass is actually protein. And that may be a newsflash for some people. It's not just a stick of chalk. So 40% of bone is made up of protein. And the combination of the figures I've got here to indicate physical activity, sunshine or vitamin D on this side of the Atlantic, whole protein foods are essentially, with protein, perfect partners for bone health. And I'm just going to highlight that it's protein mythology, or this acid-ash hypothesis, that a dietary acid load results in net calcium excretion and skeletal fragility. And I think that this is Tanis Fenton conducted this meta-analysis, and she concluded that there was no evidence that increasing the dietary acid load promotes skeletal bone mineral loss or osteoporosis. And similarly, Jane Kerstetter wrote in this review talking about protein's positive effect on bone health, but probably only in conditions of adequate calcium intake and adequate vitamin D intake. You're not going to get away from here without hearing something from me, at least, from about physical activity and exercise. And I'm going to just highlight this review talking about cardiorespiratory fitness as a fifth vital sign, as important as respiratory rate, blood pressure, and heart rate. And what I want you to say is that there is I don't have time to review it, evidence-based support for aerobic exercise and cardiorespiratory fitness in lowering the risk of heart disease, cancer, type 2 diabetes, dementia, and even depression. And we've now got enough data to include, in the dementia, we've got enough data to include Alzheimer's dementia as well. At the same time, we've got evidence-based support for strength training in lowering the risk of mortality and morbidity for cardiovascular disease, cancer, osteoporosis, osteoarthritis, and type 2 diabetes. These two modes of exercise are actually much more similar in their health effects than they are disparate. And I would direct you to this fantastic international consensus statement that Michael Izquierdo is the lead author of, and just summarizing the expert consensus and guidelines. And you can see in the column on the far right the recommendation for the exercise modality. And all of those exercise modalities include some form of aerobic, but importantly, resistance exercise as well. The last part I'm going to talk to you about is about inactivity and disuse. And I would put it to you that these are watershed moments for older people. Hospitalization and a disuse event are key moments in which older people lose muscle and function more rapidly and cannot, without aggressive rehabilitation, recover from. A real tribute to my late friend and colleague, Doug Padden-Jones here, and this is a paper that he and Kirk English wrote describing this catabolic crisis, as they called it. And this catabolic crisis can arise for a number of reasons. The pandemic was a global catabolic crisis for older people. Stay home, don't go out, and older people suffered. Social isolation was a big factor in this. And this sort of gives you an idea around this cyclical and, if you like, downward nature of what inactivity does in older people. These events are often under-recognized. In Canada, we thought it was a unique phenomenon until COVID showed up about a bad winter when an older person was hospitalized because of respiratory distress due to flu, spent 4 days in hospital, was discharged, but then convalesced at home for sometimes up to 4 to 6 weeks. And if you've ever been to Canada in February, you know why people stay inside for 4 to 6 weeks. It's very cold. And so I had the opportunity to write with Doug, and this is Don Lehman, an interesting paper. And we proposed that if older people were discharged or even in hospital, that they should initiate physical therapy early and often. That we should be taking advantage of the anabolic sensitivity that exercise confers, and instead of giving someone physical therapy first thing in the morning and then not feeding them for 3 or 4 hours, but trying to time the ingestion of the protein. It should be high-quality protein with high leucine to take advantage of that leucine trigger. And there are probably some other ingredients, including things like creatine or omega-3 fatty acids, that could add to the efficacy of that. And the idea was to mitigate the decline rather than trying to treat somebody who was discharged and bend the curve back up. You just can't do that in older people. So some of the take-home points. Protein requirements in older people are elevated, and many older people do not consume sufficient protein. Higher protein intakes lead to greater lean body mass in aging and improved function, particularly when combined with resistance training. Leucine appears to be a key amino acid, and it emphasizes the role of protein quality, so especially the highest leucine-containing proteins that we know of are dairy proteins. We found that there was no strategic advantage, and we wouldn't expect one with HMB because it's a metabolic cousin of leucine, and that physical activity and exercise improve both metabolic health, but importantly, when you get older, the preservation of muscle, and not to dismiss the importance of skeletal muscle health. Inactivity, even when it's periodic, represents a time that is a watershed moment for older people. And aggressive nutritional support during a catabolic crisis to try and mitigate the loss rather than promoting recovery, because that's just really hard to do, would be advantageous. We need more research. So I'm always happy to talk on these things, but we need longer and larger trials to make these recommendations more generalizable. So thank you very much.